Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the culinary landscape of medieval times. As you settle in for a moment of calm and relaxation, I invite you to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far our community of night owls stretches. If you enjoy immersing yourself in the rich tapestry of history to unwind, consider subscribing for more soothing stories like this. Picture, if you will, a rustic table set with a humble meal, a bowl of thin, bland porridge, a hunk of dense, coarse bread, and perhaps a few morsels of tough, stringy meat, if the diner is lucky. This is the fare that sustained the majority of people in medieval times. While kings and nobles feasted on lavish, multi-course banquets, the average peasant subsisted on a diet that was as meager as it was monotonous. What factors conspired to make food in the Middle Ages so unappetizing for the masses? Let us explore this question and transport ourselves back to a time when filling one's belly was a daily struggle. In a medieval peasant's home, the aroma of exotic spices was noticeably absent. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper. These were luxuries reserved for the wealthy, brought from distant lands by intrepid merchants. Imagine the life of a spice trader in those times, navigating the treacherous Silk Road to bring a taste of opulence to European shores. For a glimpse of the value placed on these rare flavors, consider that in the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg cost 7 fattened oxen. The prohibitive expense of spices meant that the common folk had to make do with the pungent notes of garlic, mustard, and vinegar to enliven their plain fare. The blandness of peasant cuisine was not helped by the scarcity of fresh produce. Without reliable means of preservation, fruits and vegetables were seasonal treats at best. The lucky few who had access to a plot of land might grow some hardy crops like onions, leeks, and cabbages, but these were hardly enough to balance out a diet heavily reliant on grains. Breads and porridges made from barley, rye, and wheat formed the backbone of most meals, sometimes supplemented with legumes like peas and beans. While this diet was filling, it lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth. Meat, though prized, was a rarity on the peasant table. A prosperous family might keep a pig, some chickens, or even a cow, but these animals were valuable resources not to be slaughtered lightly. Meat was reserved for special occasions, like weddings and religious feasts, or when an animal was too old or infirm to serve any other purpose. When meat was available, every scrap was used, from nose to tail. Offal or organ meats were common peasant fare, as were small birds and game caught by trapping or hunting, though poaching in the royal forest was a risky endeavor, punishable by severe penalties. Fish was more accessible than meat for those who lived near rivers or the sea, but it too was often preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to last through lean times. The result was a far cry from the delicate, flaky fillets we enjoy today. Herring, cod, and eel were among the most common catches, and they would be packed in barrels with generous amounts of salt to stave off spoilage. Freshwater fish like carp and pike were a delicacy reserved for the nobility, who maintained private fish ponds on their estates. The scarcity of fresh food meant that medieval cooks had to get creative with preservation methods. Pickling, fermentation, and drying were all common techniques to extend the shelf life of perishables. Cabbage would be shredded and fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions pickled in vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears dried for winter storage. These preserved foods added some much-needed variety to the peasant diet, but they were a far cry from the vibrant flavors of fresh produce. Even staples like bread and ale which formed the foundation of medieval sustenance, were not always trustworthy. Unscrupulous bakers might stretch their dough with fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust, leading to loaves that were as hard as rocks and about as nutritious. Ale, too, was often watered down to increase profits, a practice that earned some alewives a nasty reputation. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, weak ale was often the only safe choice, as the brewing process helped to kill off harmful bacteria. This brings us to perhaps the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining, the utter lack of hygiene. Without an understanding of germs and food safety, contamination was rampant. Livestock were often kept close to living quarters for warmth and protection, their waste seeping into the same areas where food was prepared and consumed. In crowded cities, garbage and human excrement filled the streets, tainting water sources and attracting vermin. It's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were rampant, with even royalty not immune to the perils of spoiled fare. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after overindulging in peaches and new cider, a feast that likely led to a fatal case of dysentery. The specter of disease was never far from the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread in part due to the unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were particularly notorious as breeding grounds for pestilence, with flies buzzing around meat stalls and rodents scurrying underfoot. It's a wonder that anyone survived the perils of medieval dining at all. Yet even in the face of scarcity and disease, there were glimmers of gastronomic hope. Monasteries and abbeys often served as havens of relative plenty, with well-tended gardens and orchards, providing a bounty of fresh produce. Monks were known for their culinary skills, with some even penning cookbooks that offered a glimpse into the more refined cuisine of the upper echelons. Of course, this food was not shared freely with the masses, but some monasteries did offer alms to the poor as a form of charity. For the nobility, feasts were an opportunity to showcase their wealth and power. A royal banquet might feature dozens of dishes, from roast swan and peacock to delicate pasties and sweetmeats. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttonous revelry. But even these lavish spreads were not without their dangers. Food poisoning was a common occurrence, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces taking their toll on noble stomachs, and the sheer volume of food consumed could lead to painful digestive issues. A reminder that even the privileged were not immune to the hazards of medieval dining. As we reflect on the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for the abundance and variety that we enjoy today. Our supermarkets brim with fresh produce from around the globe, our meats are safe and sanitized, and our spice racks hold flavors that would have been the envy of any medieval monarch. Yet even as we savor the fruits of modernity, we can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who made do with so little and found ways to survive in the face of unrelenting hardship. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you. Savor the flavors and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of, and raise a glass to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point. And if you find yourself grumbling about a less than perfect dish, spare a thought for the medieval diner, for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a hard-won blessing. As we let our minds drift back to that distant past, let us take comfort in the knowledge that we are the fortunate inheritors of centuries of culinary progress, And let us not forget the lessons that history has to teach us, lessons of perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of times. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity, but a source of endless delight. May your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all that we have been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval city, a baker surreptitiously glances left and right before ducking back into his shop. He pulls out a sack of sawdust and begins kneading it into the dough, stretching his meager supply of flour. For many bakers, this deception was the only way to eke out a meager living. Bread was the lifeblood of the medieval diet, but its purity was often compromised. Unscrupulous bakers would add fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust to extend their dough. What resulted was a coarse, gritty loaf that offered little nutrition. The very staple that sustained peasants through their back-breaking labor had become yet another hardship to endure. Ale and wine, too, fell victim to the desperation of the times. Alewives and innkeepers, struggling to turn a profit, would water down their brew to stretch it further. The resulting drink was a thin, sour swill that bore little resemblance to the hearty ale that was the pride of the British Isles. One such alewife, Elizabeth, toils over her bubbling cauldron, stirring in yet another bucket of cloudy water. Her children hover near, their hungry eyes watching each drip, knowing their next meal depends on this batch. As she ladles out a mug of the watered-down brew, she sighs, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale her grandmother once crafted, a family recipe now lost to necessity. In a time when clean drinking water was a rarity, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate necessity. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste, making them rife with disease. The alcohol in these drinks, though diluted, was still potent enough to kill some of the harmful bacteria, and so peasants were forced to choose between risking the sickness of tainted water or the empty calories of watered-down ale. Attempts were made to curb these deceptive practices. The assize of bread and ale, a 13th century law, set strict regulations on the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. Transgressors faced hefty fines or even time in the pillory, but with the limited means of enforcement and the desperation of the poor, these laws did little to stem the tide of food adulteration. And so the medieval peasant's lot was one of constant compromise, a balancing act between the gnawing pain of hunger and the bitter disappointment of adulterated food. Each mouthful was a reminder of their precarious existence, where even the most basic sustenance could not be taken for granted. As we delve further into the realities of medieval food, we must remember that these were not just historical facts, but the daily struggles of real people. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the very spaces in which they lived contributed to the challenges they faced in securing a decent meal. The close quarters shared by man and beast and the lack of sanitation that plagued medieval cities made the simple act of eating a perilous proposition. Picture, if you will, a small thatched cottage huddled against the chill of a medieval winter. Inside, a family huddles around a meager fire, their breath mingling with the steam rising from a bubbling pot of pottage. In the corner, a pig roots through the rushes covering the dirt floor. It snorts and grunts, a constant backdrop to the family's daily life. This was the reality for many medieval peasants, a life lived in close quarters with their livestock. Animals were often kept inside the home for warmth and safety. their dung and debris mingling with the straw and rushes that served as the only floor covering. It was a breeding ground for disease, with fleas and lice thriving in the unsanitary conditions. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was a challenge. Without a proper understanding of hygiene, even the most lavish feasts could end in tragedy. The story of King John of England serves as a poignant example. In 1216, while traveling across the country, the king fell ill after consuming a surfeit of peaches. Historians now believe these peaches were likely spoiled, leading to a case of dysentery that ultimately claimed the king's life. In the crowded cities of medieval Europe, the situation was even more dire. Narrow streets were choked with garbage and human waste, tainting the air and seeping into the water supply. In London, the River Thames served as both a source of drinking water and a dumping ground for the city's refuse. It's little wonder that disease ran rampant, with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the dreaded Black Death. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, was in part able to spread so quickly and claim so many lives due to the unsanitary conditions of medieval cities. Fleas carried by the rats that thrived in the filth became the unwitting harbingers of the plague, spreading the disease from person to person with terrifying efficiency. For the average peasant, there was little escape from these unsanitary conditions. They lived and died amidst the filth, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to disease. Even the simple act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment and comfort, became a gamble with every bite. As we consider these realities, it's easy to feel a sense of despair for the plight of the medieval peasant. But amidst this darkness, there were glimmers of light, the kindness of neighbors sharing what little they had, the solace found in faith and community. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the church, despite its own role in the hardships of the time, also offered a measure of relief and hope to the hungry and the downtrodden. The tolling of church bells marked the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. For peasants toiling in the fields, these peals signaled not just the call to prayer, but also a reprieve from the unrelenting demands of their work and their hunger. In a world where so much was uncertain, the church stood as a bastion of stability and authority. But this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which centered around food. The Catholic Church mandated frequent fasting and meatless days, particularly during the penitential season of Lent. For 40 days before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, a tall order for those already struggling to put food on the table. The story of one peasant family illustrates the hardship these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret toiled from sunup to sundown on their small plot of land, barely growing enough to feed their 3 children. When Lent arrived, they faced a daunting choice: honor the fast and risk weakening their already malnourished bodies, or defy the church and face the consequences for their immortal souls. In the end, they chose to follow the fast, subsisting on meager portions of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were gaunt and their steps heavy with exhaustion, yet they took solace in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. Despite the additional hardships these fasts imposed, the church was not entirely deaf to the plight of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often served as a source of food aid, distributing bread and alms to the needy as a form of Christian charity. The monks, with their vast lands and resources, were able to provide a measure of relief to the hungry masses. Yet even this charity had its limits. When crops failed and famine struck, the demand for aid often outstripped the church's ability to provide, and for those caught poaching in the royal forests, a desperate attempt to supplement their meager diets with fresh game, the church's mercy was noticeably absent. Poachers, if caught, faced severe punishments, from maiming to death, regardless of their circumstances. And so, the church's influence on medieval food was a double-edged sword. It provided solace and aid to some while imposing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and a further trial to endure in the face of unrelenting hunger. As we turn our gaze to the final chapter of our journey through medieval food, we'll witness a scene of shocking contrast: the opulent feast of a noble household against the backdrop of peasant hardship. These lavish displays serve as a stark reminder of the vast inequalities that defined the era. The great hall of the castle is alive with the flicker of 100 candles. Tapestries line the walls, their vibrant threads telling stories of heroic deeds and courtly love. At the head of the room, on a raised dais, the lord and lady preside over a scene of opulence and plenty. Down the center of the hall stretches a massive oak table, groaning under the weight of countless dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skins crackling and golden, jostle for space with elegant silver platters of delicately spiced peacock. Baskets overflow with fresh baked man-shaped bread, each loaf as white and soft as a cloud. The air is thick with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves, spices so precious they're worth their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the master cook orchestrates a symphony of culinary creation. He barks orders at his underlings, who scurry to baste the meats, stir the pots, and plate the elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures crafted into fanciful shapes of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast is a chance to showcase his artistry and ingenuity, to solidify his reputation, and secure his place in his lord's favor. As the feast progresses, the diners gorge themselves on a seemingly endless parade of dishes. They tear into the tender flesh of roast venison, sip on creamy almond soup, and savor the delicate flavor of blancmange, a dish of shredded chicken mixed with rice, milk, and sugar. They wash it all down with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. But even amidst this revelry, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval life. A noblewoman, her face flushed with wine, suddenly pales and excuses herself from the table, her stomach churning from the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth rotting from the sugary delicacies, winces in pain as he bites into a particularly tough piece of meat. And hovering at the edges of the hall, the serving staff watch the excesses of their betters with a mixture of envy and resentment. They know that tomorrow they'll be back to their usual fare of coarse bread and thin gruel, the memory of this feast a taunting reminder of the gulf between their world and that of their masters. As the last plates are cleared and the final crumbs are swept away, we're left to ponder the stark contrasts of medieval food. For the nobility, feasts were a display of wealth, status, and power, a chance to revel in the finest delicacies the land had to offer. But for the vast majority, food was a daily struggle, a constant battle against scarcity, adulteration, and disease. In our modern world of abundance and choice, it's easy to forget the hardships faced by our medieval ancestors. But by understanding their struggles, we gain a deeper appreciation for the comforts we enjoy today. So as we sit down to our own meals, let us take a moment to savor not just the flavors on our tongues, but the hard-won progress that allows us to eat with such ease and variety. And let us raise a glass to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point, and to the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of time. As we've journeyed through the landscape of medieval food, we've encountered a world of scarcity, hardship, and inequality, from the bland monotony of peasant pottage to the dangerous fillers in adulterated bread. The challenges of feeding oneself in the Middle Ages were unrelenting. We've seen how the lack of variety in spices, the difficulties of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions all conspired to make medieval food a far cry from the cornucopias we enjoy today. We've witnessed the impact of the church's fasting edicts, adding spiritual burdens to the already heavy load of the poor, and we've marveled at the opulent feasts of the nobility, a glittering contrast to the grim realities faced by most. But through it all, we've also seen glimmers of humanity's indomitable spirit, the ingenuity of cooks making the most of meager ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing what little they had, and the solace found in the rituals of faith and feast. In our modern world, it's easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can dine in restaurants serving cuisines from around the globe, or have a world of flavors delivered right to our doorstep. But imagine for a moment transporting a medieval peasant into the aisles of a modern grocery store. The sheer variety would be overwhelming. The vibrant colors of the produce section, the gleaming refrigerated cases filled with milk and eggs, the shelves upon shelves of pre-packaged meals and snacks. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We grapple with the environmental impact of our food systems, with issues of access and inequality, and with the health consequences of overabundance. In our quest for convenience and choice, we sometimes forget the value of simplicity, of seasonal eating and local flavors. Perhaps then, there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors. Even as we appreciate how far we've come, we can embrace the joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, the satisfaction of a dish made with care and creativity. We can remember the value of preserving and cherishing the bounty of the earth, rather than taking it for granted. And most of all, we can approach our own meals with a sense of gratitude and wonder, recognizing the incredible journey that food has taken to reach our plates, from the sun-drenched fields to the bustling kitchens to the warmth of our own tables. Each bite is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit across the ages. So as we end our journey through the annals of medieval food, let us raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup, to the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today. And in honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where all may eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. As the royal cook bustled about the castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast, most of his fellow countrymen could only dream of such opulence. For the serf toiling in the fields, a meal was a simple affair of coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew of whatever vegetables or scraps could be found. On a good day, there might be a bit of salted pork or dried fish to add some flavor to the gruel-like mix. but more often than not it was a bland and unsatisfying fare that left the belly only half full. The life of a peasant in medieval times was one of unrelenting hardship, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their daily sustenance. While the nobles dined on exotic dishes flavored with costly spices from faraway lands, the common folk subsisted on a diet that was as monotonous as it was meager. But even the privileged were not immune to the perils of medieval food. The lavish feasts that were the hallmark of aristocratic life often came with a hidden cost. With no means of refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat, and many a noble fell ill or even died from consuming contaminated fare. The very excesses that were meant to showcase their wealth and status could prove to be their undoing. Such was the fate of King John of England, whose untimely death in 1216 was attributed to a surfeit of peaches. As the story goes, the king was traveling through the town of King's Lynn when he was seized by a terrible case of dysentery. Some say it was brought on by the rich food he had consumed at a nearby abbey, while others blamed the peaches he had eaten with relish. Whatever the cause, the king's condition quickly worsened, and he died a few days later, his reign cut short by a humble fruit. It is a testament to the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages that even the most powerful and privileged were not safe from the dangers that lurked in their food. For the vast majority of people, however, the risks were even greater. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, the temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too great to resist. This was especially true in times of dearth, when crops failed and food was scarce. During these lean years, people would resort to eating whatever they could find, even if it meant risking their health or even their lives. Acorns, grass, and other wild plants were often ground into a coarse flour to make bread, while animals that had died of disease were sometimes consumed out of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that would be unthinkable today. Unscrupulous bakers would stretch their dough with fillers like sawdust or chalk, while brewers would water down their ale to increase their profits. Such practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous, as they could lead to serious illness or even death. The alewife who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life, and one who often bore the brunt of the community's suspicions and resentments. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with noxious substances or even of practicing witchcraft. In a world where superstition held sway, the line between a bad batch of ale and a deadly poison was often blurred. Despite the many challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of respite and togetherness. And for the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders would be further restricted. For 40 long days they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and to draw closer to God. But for others, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was so often scarce and unpredictable, The idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed like the height of insanity. And yet, despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of the meager ingredients available to them, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is a reminder of how far we have come in terms of food safety, variety, and abundance, but also of how much we still have in common with our ancestors. For just as they struggled to put food on the table and to nourish their families, so too do we grapple with the challenges of our own time, from climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life. As we sit down to our own meals, laden with a dizzying array of flavors and ingredients from all corners of the globe, it is easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that have brought us to this point. But by understanding the history of our food and the ways in which it has shaped our culture and our identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity that we enjoy today. So, the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us to this point, and give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who have toiled to put food on our tables and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest of challenges. Perhaps if a medieval peasant were to somehow be transported to a modern grocery store, they would be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from faraway lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of packaged and processed foods. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty, and yet they might also feel a sense of unease or even distrust, wondering at the hidden costs and compromises that have made such abundance possible. They might question the methods by which our food is grown and raised, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. In the end, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with the simple fare that has sustained them for generations. For while our modern food system may offer us greater choice and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own challenges and drawbacks. And just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what they had, to find joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, so too must we learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies, but also our souls, that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and that leave a legacy of health and abundance for generations to come. And so, let us raise a toast to the humble peasant, the hard-working farmer, the skilled artisan, and all those who have labored to put food on our tables throughout history. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today. And in honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where all may eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. As we've seen, the medieval spice trade was a lucrative but perilous business. Those who controlled the flow of spices could amass great fortunes, while those who toiled to bring these precious commodities to Europe risked life and limb. One such spice merchant was a man named Giovanni de Marinoli, born in the early 14th century to a noble Florentine family Giovanni seemed destined for a life of ease and comfort, but a restless spirit and a thirst for adventure led him down a different path. In 1338, Giovanni set out on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the bustling ports of Italy to the distant lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, his official purpose was to spread the Christian faith. But Giovanni was also a keen businessman, always on the lookout for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe.